Imagine packing your bags, ready for an epic adventure, only to find out, boom, your dream destination is off-limits. Surprising, right? In 2025, there are places Americans simply can't visit anymore, whether due to political tensions, new visa restrictions, or outright travel bans. But which countries made the list, and why? Could your favorite vacation spot be one of them? Stick around as we dive into 10 destinations where US travelers are no longer welcome. And some of these might just shock you. Would you risk visiting anyway? Or is it time to rethink that bucket list? Let's find out. Number 10. Russia. Imagine you're in Moscow, standing in front of the breathtaking St. Basil's Cathedral. Basil's Cathedral, taking in the colorful domes while sipping a warm Russian tea. Maybe later, you hop on the Trans-Siberian Railway, crossing thousands of miles of vast snow-covered landscapes. Sounds like an epic adventure, right? Well, as of 2025, that's nothing more than a dream. Because for Americans, Russia is officially off-limits. US-Russia relations have hit an all-time low, with over 90% of American tourist visas rejected since 2023. The Kremlin has labeled the US a hostile nation, leading to strict travel bans and even threats of arrest for Americans who enter. If you somehow manage to get a visa, which is about as rare as spotting a polar bear in Times Square, you'll be under constant surveillance. According to reports, at least 150 Americans have been detained in Russia over the past 2 years, accused of spying or political interference. And here's another major issue. No flights. Direct flights from New York to Moscow, which once carried over 1.3 million passengers annually, have been completely suspended. Even layovers in Turkey or Dubai are risky, since Russian border officials have a blacklist of suspected American visitors. And let's talk about money. If you do manage to enter, you can't use Visa, MasterCard, or American Express, since they stopped operating in Russia in 2022. So, unless you have stacks of rubles hidden under your mattress, you're pretty much stranded. Oh, and let's not forget safety concerns. The US State Department has issued a Level 4 Do Not Travel advisory, warning that Americans face a high risk of wrongful detention. Look at journalist Evan Gershkovich, who has been locked up since March 2023, accused of espionage with no trial date in sight. It's a dangerous game, and once you're in, there's no guarantee you'll get out. Bottom line, if Russian prison isn't on your bucket list, it's best to skip Russia altogether in 2025. Number 9. Cuba. Cuba, the land of classic cars, salsa music, and world-famous cigars, is so close to the US that you could literally sail there in 3 hours. But despite being just 90 miles from Florida, getting into Cuba as an American in 2025 is harder than ever. Let's rewind a bit. Back in 2016, President Obama opened travel to Cuba, making it easier for Americans to visit. Tourists rushed in, filling Havana's colorful streets, drinking mojitos on the Malecon, and snapping Instagram-worthy pics in front of pink 1950s Cadillacs. In 2018, over 600,000 Americans visited Cuba. But under Trump's new policies in 2025, Cuba is once again off-limits. The strict travel bans have returned, and the rules are worse than ever. If you're an American, you can't simply book a flight and go. US citizens are banned from general tourism and can only visit under one of 12 approved categories, like educational or humanitarian work. In other words, no casual vacations. Want to just chill on a Cuban beach? Forget it. Even if you qualify under an approved category, things aren't easy. Direct flights from Miami to Havana, which once had 20 daily departures, have been cut by over 70%. If you do make it, you can't stay in most hotels. Why? Because the US has blacklisted over 200 hotels that are linked to the Cuban government. Even Airbnb has seen a 30% drop in listings due to new restrictions. And if you're thinking, what if I just sneak in through Mexico or the Bahamas? That's a terrible idea. The US government is cracking down on illegal visits. Since 2022, over 800 Americans have been fined for violating the Cuba travel ban, with penalties reaching up to $100,000 per person. Imagine blowing your life savings just for a weekend in Havana. To make matters worse, US credit and debit cards don't work in Cuba. If you forget to bring enough cash, you're basically stranded. So unless you want to risk getting hit with a massive fine or having your bank account frozen, you might want to hold off on that Cuba trip. Number 8. Venezuela. Venezuela was once a stunning tourist destination, home to Angel Falls, the world's highest waterfall at 3,212 feet, gorgeous Caribbean beaches, and some of the best rum in the world. But now, it's one of the most dangerous places for Americans. Let's break it down. First, the US and Venezuelan governments haven't gotten along for years. Relations hit rock bottom after the US imposed heavy sanctions in 2019, and things have only gotten worse. In 2025, the Trump administration banned all travel to Venezuela, calling it a national security risk. If you try to go, you'll be denied entry, or worse, detained. The country itself is in economic freefall. Inflation is at a staggering 400%, and the local currency, the bolívar, is basically worthless. To put that into perspective, in 2020, a cup of coffee in Caracas cost 1,500,000 bolívars. Today, some basic goods like toilet paper and milk are more expensive than in the US. Then there's the issue of crime. Venezuela has one of the highest murder rates in the world, with over 36,000 violent deaths per year. Kidnappings are rampant, and Americans are often prime targets. Since 2021, over 25 US citizens have been arrested under vague charges with no fair trials. And if you somehow survive all that, good luck getting home. Major airlines like American Airlines, Delta, and United stopped flying to Venezuela in 2019. And by 2025, there are 0 direct flights between the US and Caracas. If you do make it in, you're on your own. So, unless you're craving danger, Venezuela is one place where Americans are not welcome in 2025. Number 7. Afghanistan. If there's one country that has been completely erased from American travel maps, it's Afghanistan. Once a land of majestic mountains, ancient Silk Road cities, and breathtaking valleys, Afghanistan is now one of the most dangerous places in the world for Americans. Let's get straight to the numbers. Afghanistan has been in a state of war for over 40 years. After the US military's chaotic withdrawal in August 2021, the Taliban took complete control. Since then, over 80% of international aid has been cut, leading to one of the worst humanitarian crises on the planet. Nearly 24 million Afghans, more than half the population, are facing food insecurity, and the economy is in freefall. But here's where it gets even scarier. If you're an American tourist, you are seen as an enemy by the Taliban government. Since 2021, at least 10 US citizens have been detained, accused of spying or violating Sharia law. In 2023, American YouTuber Miles Routledge was arrested and held for months without any trial. His crime? Being a foreigner in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, let's talk about safety. The US State Department has issued a Level 4 Do Not Travel Advisory for Afghanistan, warning that Americans face a high risk of kidnapping and assassination. In 2024 alone, over 200 foreigners were taken hostage by armed groups, often demanding millions in ransom. If you're an American, the ransom price is even higher, and the US government does not negotiate with terrorists. Even if you somehow get in and stay safe, Afghanistan's infrastructure is barely functioning. The Kabul International Airport, once a gateway for thousands of travelers, now operates with limited international flights, mostly to Pakistan and Iran. There are no US embassies or consulates, meaning if you get into trouble, you're on your own. So, unless you're planning to risk your life for an adventure, Afghanistan is one country that no American should even consider visiting in 2025. Number 6. Somalia. If you've ever seen the movie Captain Phillips with Tom Hanks, then you already know that Somalia has a pirate problem. But here's the thing. Pirates aren't the only danger in Somalia. This East African country is one of the most lawless places on Earth, and for Americans, it's a one-way ticket to danger. Let's start with some hard facts. Somalia has been without a fully functioning government since 1991. For over 30 years, warlords, terrorist groups, and militias have fought for control, leading to one of the highest crime rates in the world. The The terrorist group Al-Shabaab, which has close ties to Al-Qaeda, controls large parts of the country and actively targets Westerners. Since 2010, Al-Shabaab has carried out over 1,000 bombings, kidnappings, and attacks, including the 2017 Mogadishu bombing that killed over 500 people, one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in history. In 2024 alone, more than 50 foreign nationals were kidnapped, with Americans being the top targets. The reason? Ransom money. And it's not just land that's dangerous. Somalia's coastline is one of the most pirate-infested waters in the world. In 2023, there were over 40 pirate attacks, with some ships paying ransoms as high as $10 million. If you're an American and somehow find yourself in Somali waters, good luck. Let's talk infrastructure. The Mogadishu International Airport is operational, but flights are extremely limited and often canceled due to terrorist threats. Once you're in the country, you won't find basic necessities like running water, stable electricity, or even safe roads. And forget about getting U.S. embassy help. The United States shut down its embassy in Somalia back in 1991. If you still think visiting Somalia sounds like an adventure, consider this. The U.S. State Department has labeled Somalia as one of the highest-risk countries in the world for American citizens. The message is clear. If you go, you may never come back. Number 5. Yemen. Yemen was once a land of stunning deserts, ancient skyscraper cities, and world-famous coffee. But today, it's one of the most dangerous war zones on the planet. Since 2014, Yemen has been locked in a brutal civil war between the Houthi rebels and the Saudi-backed Yemeni government. Over the past decade, more than 377,000 people have died, and millions are on the brink of starvation. The United Nations calls it the world's worst humanitarian crisis, with over 80% of the population relying on aid just to survive. For Americans, things are especially bad. The U.S. government completely shut down its embassy in Sana'a in 2015, meaning if you get into trouble, there's no one to help you. Since 2020, at least 40 foreign nationals have been kidnapped, with many being sold to extremist groups for ransom. And let's talk about flights. There are no direct commercial flights from the U.S. to Yemen. If you somehow make it in, expect constant drone strikes, bombings, and unpredictable violence. In 2023 alone, there were over 1,500 airstrikes, and terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, are actively targeting Westerners. Even basic survival is a challenge. Food, water, and medicine are scarce. The cost of a simple meal has skyrocketed by over 500%, and power outages are a daily reality. Hospitals are overwhelmed, and cholera outbreaks have affected more than 2 million people since 2017. And here's a terrifying fact. If you're caught by Houthi rebels, you might never be seen again. Since 2019, at least 10 Americans have been detained under false espionage charges, with some disappearing without a trace. The bottom line? Yemen is a full-blown war zone, and for Americans, there's no safe way in or out. Unless you have a death wish, this is one country you should never, ever visit. Number 4. Libya. Libya was once an oasis of Mediterranean beauty. Think beautiful beaches, ancient Roman ruins, and rich desert landscapes. But now, it's a hotbed of political instability, terrorism, and armed conflict that makes it an incredibly dangerous place for American travelers. Libya's political system has been in shambles since 2011, when the NATO-backed revolution overthrew dictator Muammar Gaddafi. What followed was complete chaos. Competing militias, extremist groups, and foreign powers all vying for control of this oil-rich nation. Today, Libya is divided between multiple factions, each claiming control of different parts of the country. This makes travel extremely dangerous, as violent clashes between rival factions happen daily. For Americans, Libya is a complete no-go zone. The U.S. State Department has issued a Level 4 Do Not Travel advisory for the country due to the high risk of terrorism, kidnapping, and armed conflict. If you're thinking of visiting Libya for historical sites like the Leptis Magna ruins or the Mediterranean coast, think again. No embassy exists to help you in the event of trouble. In 2023 alone, over 50 foreign nationals were kidnapped, and many of these victims were targeted for ransom. On top of that, extremist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda are active in Libya, regularly carrying out bombings and ambushes. According to reports, Libya ranks as one of the top countries where Americans are at risk of being captured or killed. Let's also look at some hard stats to give you a better picture of how bad it is. According to the United Nations, over 2 million Libyans are displaced due to the ongoing conflict, and more than 50,000 people have been killed since 2011. Libya's infrastructure is in ruins, and access to healthcare and basic services is extremely limited. The streets of Tripoli and other major cities are often controlled by armed militias, making it nearly impossible for foreigners to move around safely. If you were hoping to explore this North African jewel, Libya has sadly fallen off the map for tourists, and for good reason. Number 3. Syria. Syria is another country that was once known for its ancient ruins, rich culture, and stunning landscapes. But since the start of the Syrian civil war in 2011, it has become one of the most dangerous places on Earth for any foreigner, particularly Americans. Over 500,000 people have died in the Syrian civil war, and half the population has been displaced. That's around 13 million Syrians, who have either fled the country or lost their homes. The ongoing violence has made travel virtually impossible, and the US government has been clear about its stance: do not visit Syria. Here's a sobering stat. Since 2011, over 100,000 foreign fighters have traveled to Syria to join extremist groups, most notably ISIS. These groups target Americans and Westerners for kidnapping, ransom, or worse. In fact, in 2023 alone, 4 American citizens were taken hostage by various militant groups, and their fates remain unknown. Traveling in Syria means navigating war-torn landscapes filled with landmines, sniper fire, and military checkpoints. If you're not careful, you might accidentally wander into a battle zone, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. Syria's airports and roads are often bombed or closed off due to active fighting. In fact, the US Embassy in Damascus has been closed since 2012, and it's nearly impossible for any Americans to obtain visas or support if they get into trouble. And it doesn't stop there. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, chemical weapon attacks have been used by various factions in the ongoing conflict, making the environment even more hazardous. The United Nations has called Syria the most dangerous conflict zone, and for good reason. If you were hoping for a glimpse into Syria's rich history or beautiful landscapes, your best bet is to explore it from a distance, because in 2025, Syria remains a place that no American should step foot in. Number 2. Iran. Iran is a country filled with ancient ruins, breathtaking landscapes, and a rich cultural history. It's home to the incredible Persepolis ruins and the stunning Persian Gulf coastline. So why wouldn't Americans be able to visit this treasure trove of history and beauty? The short answer? Political tensions and state-sponsored hostility toward the US. Since the 1979 Islamic Revolution and the subsequent hostage crisis, relations between the US and Iran have been severely strained. In fact, the US State Department has issued a Level 4 Do Not Travel advisory for Iran, citing the risk of detention for Americans and the country's deep anti-Western sentiment. Let's get into some numbers. Since 2019, the Iranian government has detained at least 150 Americans, many on spurious charges of espionage or threatening national security. Some of these detainees were held in solitary confinement for months without trial, with many forced to confess to crimes they didn't commit. And while Iran continues to deny US citizens entry, they also maintain a hostile relationship with the US government, making it a risky bet for any American tourist hoping to explore the country. Even if you manage to get in, the risks of being arrested or kidnapped by local authorities are high. Iranian law is severe. Violating any local law, no matter how minor, could lead to a lengthy prison sentence or worse. The US Embassy in Tehran was shut down in 1979, leaving American citizens with no assistance in case they get into trouble. Simply put, Iran is a country best avoided by Americans in 2025, given the political hostility, potential for detention, and uncertain safety. Number 1. North Korea. And now, the final, most extreme case, North Korea. You've probably heard about it in the news countless times, but here's the deal. North Korea is completely off limits for Americans, and for very good reason. Let's start with a sobering fact. North Korea has one of the most restrictive, oppressive governments on Earth. Under Kim Jong-un's rule, the country is a closed society, where even the smallest violation of its laws could lead to death sentences or long-term imprisonment in labor camps. The US government has enforced a complete travel ban on North Korea, and the State Department has issued a Level 4 Do Not Travel advisory due to the high risk of arrest and detention. In fact, more than 16 Americans have been detained in North Korea in the past 10 years. Many of these individuals were accused of crimes as minor as leaving a Bible in their hotel room, with severe penalties for the slightest infractions. North Korea is a nightmare for tourists. If you manage to visit, you'll be chaperoned by government minders at all times, and nothing you do is truly private. The country is filled with surveillance and punitive measures for foreigners who step out of line. If you think you can casually explore Pyongyang, think again. Everything is tightly controlled. Here's an insane stat. Since 2008, more than 30 Americans have been detained in North Korea, and many of them spent months or even years in prison before being released. The most famous case was Otto Warmbier, a 22-year-old American who was detained in 2016 for allegedly stealing a propaganda poster. He was returned to the US in a coma, and he tragically passed away shortly after. Long story short, North Korea is as dangerous as it gets for Americans in 2025, and visiting it could cost you more than just your freedom. It could cost you your life.